Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar, What is BI Ops? Why you will fail without it. I'm Mike Smitherman. I look after sales and marketing over here at Metric Insights. And also again have Marius with me. Hey Marius.
Hello everyone.
So just the usual housekeeping items. Lines are muted for the webinar as we go pretty big audience, but obviously as always we'll be taking questions through the Q&A window. So if you have questions, please enter them as you think about them. We'll either pick them up as we go along or save some time at the end to get to those. And as always, this webinar is being recorded, so we'll be following up with the usual link to the recording so that you can review it and share it with your colleagues afterwards. So I think they're the housekeeping things. So with that, I guess we'll get started. So we're going to run through the usual sort of slides to tee up what we're talking about, and then we'll transition over to give you a small product demo of how some of the things we're going to be talking about could be implemented in tools like the Metric Insights platform. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Marius, and we'll get kicked off.
Thank you, Mike. So first, I want to talk a few moments about DevOps before we talk about BI Ops and what it is and why it's so important. So any of you that have been involved in software development and have tried to do software development at scale are very familiar with DevOps. And in fact, it's almost inconceivable today that anyone would try to do a large-scale software development effort without having some form of DevOps in place. And that's because DevOps provides some absolutely essential services to the software development effort. For example, change management. So, with the DevOps in place, you make sure that as you make changes to your code, that those changes are propagated in a very structured fashion, in a way that is, conducive to ensuring high quality continuously in the code. DevOps provides continuous integration. So there's some mechanism by which you can ensure that as you build new code, that new code cohabitates well, plays nicely with the existing code, that there's not going to be some situation where you've broken your application by deploying some new change that's inconsistent with the old code that you have in place. DevOps also provides release pipelines, so a structured methodology by which you take the new code that you're deploying and get it through the release process with the right necessary QA checks in place and everything that's required to make sure that there are no issues in the deployment. And then finally, automated deploy scripts that allow you to take the code and move it into production in a very structured way without any kind of manual intervention required and ensure that nothing breaks through that entire process. So in many ways, if you look at it in total, you can think of DevOps as acting as guardrails around the entire software engineering process. The same idea really applies to BI Ops. So you can think of BI Ops as DevOps for BI. So if you're going to do all these things for a software development effort, you should have the same thing in place for a large enterprise scale BI implementation. And these guardrails in the BI implementation provide, the BI Ops provides these guardrails and the automation that ensures that your BI applications are successful at scale. When you've got hundreds of dashboards out there, or thousands in some cases, and that these applications in total generate a really high level of user engagement. Because at the end of the day, with BI, your BI is working well, your code is effective, if in fact your user community is highly engaged with that content and using it to drive business decisions. So why is BI Ops so important? Well, to understand that, I think we have to come to terms with a truth that really a lot of us don't like to admit. And that is that all BI content, all dashboards, all reports, they all have a sell-by date. That is that the content that you create today that's incredibly useful to your users, 6 months, a year and a half down the line, it may not have the same level of utility. And in fact, unlike a sell-by date on a can, which maybe you can determine, for that food, when the expiration is going to be when you put it up on the shelf in the supermarket. With BI, it's a little different. You don't necessarily know when you're publishing your content, when it's going to expire, but you know that eventually it will. So, for example, if I'm publishing maybe a sales operations dashboard that's looking at my sales reps' performance relative to their target, well, that might be great and perfectly useful until the point in time when the VP decides to realign the territories or to change the way that sales compensation should work or how sales reps are measured, right? So as another example, if I created a great analysis on sales forecasts for my business, but I happened to do it right before COVID hit and lockdowns took over, well, the shelf life on that is probably quite a bit shorter than I might have anticipated when I first published it. So everything has some form of shelf life. And the problem is that when we look at a typical process for how we manage BI content, we are ignoring this fact. Right? So what typically happens? Well, an analyst will build a new report. They'll throw it out there. If they're lucky, it turns out to be something useful that the users will like to use, and they'll see initial engagement around that sort of starting to spike. So more and more people are using this content. They're getting great feedback. Hey, that's great report, Frank. You've done a good job with it. People are excited with it. Over time, as that content sort of starts to approach its sell-by date, if you like, that usage drops, and eventually that usage will go to zero, and invariably that piece of content will then sit with all of the other obsolete content in the repository that there for people to use because nobody's really removing it. And so what essentially happens as a result, it's as if you had a supermarket. And the user experience for somebody consuming content in that supermarket is they would go in and, every jug of milk that they looked at, 9 out of 10 jugs of milk they look at have an expiration date that's in the past, right? That would obviously be a pretty horrendous experience for anyone shopping. And if you were shopping in such a supermarket, you would never come back, right? And yet, this is exactly what we're doing for our users every day in the way that they consume content in their BI environment. So, we had, as an example, one of our customers recently had asked us to do an audit of their BI environment. They have, hundreds of different pieces of content for thousands of users, and in excess of 90% of their content was not getting usage at all. And it was exactly this phenomena that I'm showing here, just building up over time until the vast majority of content is actually not useful, and there's only a little bit of content there that's accessible. And to somebody new coming in to use that environment, that is a completely untenuous situation, right? It just creates this enormous amount of clutter where I can't really find the things that I need. And so the reasons for that, right, are that we don't have a few things in place. We don't have a standardized process for vetting assets. We don't have a way to make sure that the content that is getting published in the first place is actually useful, is generating value to the business, right? So having a methodology where that is assured oftentimes is not in place. Second, there's a problem where we don't do a good job of tracking or have a process by which you're monitoring and determining when things are approaching their sell-by date and removing that content from the system so that everything gets decluttered. Then there's really often no way to have change management in a very structured, traceable way. So in that model of where you have the Devops model where everything is moved through source code control or changes are tracked, there's a change log in place. All those mechanisms are often absent in a BI environment where people are just making changes, publishing content, and not necessarily following a very structured, rigorous process to ensure that there's traceability and auditability around all those changes. And then finally, because of all this, there's just a lack of ownership around the content that's out there. So you'll have ownership for newly created content. There'll be a developer that is familiar with it, that knows it. But for those things that were published 2 years ago by somebody who subsequently left the company, well, good luck finding an owner for that, right? It's just sitting there, and everyone's worried about creating the new content rather than taking ownership of it. So that creates sort of this completely untenable situation. So BI Ops is really all about adding that structure and the automation that puts this whole situation under control. How do we do that? Well, first, with BI Ops, you make sure that assets are vetted and certified before they're published. So nothing makes it out into the pristine environment where users are consuming it without going through a agreed upon formalized process where you ensure that there's actual value in that asset. And that process is going to vary depending upon what kind of asset is going to be published and what level of certification you're generating. So, this is kind of a typical type of situation. You might have 3 different levels of certification: bronze, silver, and gold. And depending upon that level of certification, different criteria is required. So, for example, your bronze level certified content might just be content that your BI analyst vets and checks against other certified contents and verifies that, yes, in fact, the number here that I'm showing for sales, I can reconcile that to other certified reports that are out there around sales. So I know that there's some consistency. So I've verified that, and it's ready to go, and I'm pushing that out. Silver level certification kind of goes beyond that. It says, well, this dashboard not only has been verified by the developer to make sure the numbers are consistent with other content, but there's been a business owner who's been involved in this, and they have associated this with enterprise KPIs, with key glossary terms, with certified terminology that has been defined and agreed upon by the business. And this business owner is saying that this dashboard accurately measures that particular term. So in the example I gave originally with a sales, maybe the sales ops engineer make sure that the dashboard's correct, and then somebody in the business verifies that, yes, where this actually conforms to the agreed upon policies around recognition of how territories are aligned and so forth, right? And so that's a silver certified content. And then gold certified, maybe there you're even extending even further, and you're saying, well, now the data steward needs to be involved as well. And we're certifying that in addition to those other items, that the underlying data is coming from a source that is the approved source for this information, and that it in fact has monitoring in place, so that if there's any issue with the data pipelining, that there's going to be notifications that get sent to any consumers of this information to alert them of that. So that's the highest level of certification. So this kind of process instituting is critical to making sure that the right content's out there, and that somebody consuming this content understands what level of certification is in place and what that certification level really means. Then next, once you've got something out there, or once you're getting ready to put it out there, having a change control process in place to ensure that of course, the publishing happens as we described it, but then any changes that occur also move through a process that are vetted so that you do not have surprises, and that there's a logging of those changes, that there's auditability, change history, things of that nature, and that is visible to a user. So if I'm looking at a report and I'm seeing a number that's a little bit different than what I saw last week because the definition has changed, I can immediately tell that, oh, here's a report, here's the information, here's why it changed. There was a new version that was shipped yesterday, and in this change history for this particular version, I can see that the developer changed the rule because the business rule around how this particular metric has in place has changed. So implementing that kind of mechanism. Additionally, it's very important to recognize that first process of establishing certification is only the beginning, because you could have content out there that is certified, that is published, that is 100% pristine at the time of certification, but 6 months later, the business rules have changed, or the data source that's being used is no longer the right data source. There's a more current, more complete data source for that information. So anything of that nature could affect the certification level and could affect the various metadata that's been associated with that object. So it's important to have an attestation process, a process by which after content has been certified and published, that there is on a recurring basis, on a periodic basis, somebody comes back and attests to the fact that this content is still relevant, that the metadata associated with it is still correct. If it's been certified, that it still qualifies for the certification level that has been set. And having that automated is very important. Next, it's important to have a process by which you're continuously monitoring usage and feedback of the content. So we said that everything has a life cycle. It might be a long life cycle, a short life cycle, but every piece of asset has a life cycle. The only way to know how close you are to the end of that life cycle is if you're monitoring actively usage and engagement with that content. And that is both implicit and explicit usage. What I mean by that is you want to be able to both understand what are users telling you about that content. Is it useful to them? Is there a gap, or is it doing everything that they need? And then what are they telling you through their actions, right? So what are they telling you through how much engagement you're getting through the content? Is everyone using it continuously? Not so much. What's the trend on that engagement? All that information tells you where you are in that life cycle for that content. So how do you put all this into play, right? We've talked about kind of what BIOps is, why it's important, and what are the key hallmarks to establishing effective BIOps. Well, what do you need from a technology perspective to make that happen? The answer to that is a portal, because a BI portal, to your end users, it feels like a way for them to consume their content in this beautiful garden where all their content is curated and organized for them. But really, underneath, under the covers, it is a governance platform. And it's a platform that, if implemented correctly, should enable all of these BIOps capabilities that we're talking about today. So let's walk through the steps of what are the key components that have to be brought together in this BIOps framework bioportal solution. First, you need to have a way to publish content. And it needs to be done in a way where you can synchronize with what you have in your existing BI stack. So obviously, you don't want to have to manually bring in all your content into your BI tools. You want a synchronization process where it comes in, and then there is a publishing process by which you then identify what needs to be moved into it. And you want to be able to have a way to add metadata and extend the content beyond what's there in the BI tool, but any information that's useful in the BI tool that you want to be visible in the portal should be automatically synchronized. Then the portal needs to enable a formalized, well-structured publishing process that is simultaneously rigorous and lightweight. So it should be possible. There should be workflows that are enabled in the publishing process that are suitable to the content and to the audience that you're publishing to, and that allow proper checks in place, while also enabling the content publisher to very quickly move content into a certification section, add documentation, add additional metadata, and do so in a way that's lightweight, because no one is going to adopt processes that are heavyweight and require lots and lots of effort. Then once that content has been published, the BI portal needs to enable monitoring that does both that implicit and explicit type of monitoring on usage and activity, and takes a look at feedback. So you need to have a way in which you can collect feedback from your users to tell you what do they think of the content, how do they rate it, and what, from a subjective perspective, are there any gaps, are there things that they need to address. And having that really shape the experience of consuming that content. Because if the feedback is positive on a piece of content, then we should be bubbling that content up for more users, thereby extending the shelf life of that content. And then finally, there is essentially an update process, a continuous improvement process that needs to be overlaid on here. So you need to have that attestation where you're periodically checking the content that has been deemed to be useful, and identifying that yes, it should continue to be certified. Yes, the metadata on it continues to be correct. That way users can count on that information when they're working with that content. And then for that content that has reached the shelf life, you need a process by which you're going to deprecate that content. so that you don't have that situation where 90% of the content in your environment is actually obsolete or duplicative or not useful. But in fact, everything on those supermarket shelves for users is fresh, is current, is well within its sell-by date, so that the user consuming it is delighted with consuming that content, and they have this wonderful experience, and not the experience of stumbling across a bunch of obsolete, useless pieces of information. So with that, I'm going to transition over to Mike, and he's going to show you some examples of how this is accomplished with the metric insights.
Yeah, thanks, Marius. So let's let me just stop sharing the slides here, and let's share product. Okay, so as Marius said, I'm going to jump into the Metric Insights platform here and talk us through some of those concepts that Marius was talking about. And to essentially start, as we spoke about, the backbone of all of this is really about having a centralized place, we call it a BI portal, a centralized place where BI teams can publish and certify content, as we'll look at. So a single place to control some of the processes that Marius was talking about, but also a single place where users can come and consume that content, hiding the complexities of where it may exist in the back-end systems. And so, for those that have seen any of our webinars before, this will be somewhat familiar, but what we're looking at here is the Metric Insights catalog component of the portal, where each of these tiles that you see on the screen here is essentially a particular report or dashboard or asset that has been published into the catalog that I, as a user, have got access to. And so you can see we have content coming from different tools and technologies. And what's important, and the reason, or one of the reasons why the BI portal is important, is the processes that we have in place need to be consistent across these different tools and technologies for BI ops to be successful in the organization. So we'll come back and look at the catalog in more detail, but the conversation today is really about, okay, how do we manage the content within this catalog in an effective way, making sure we're taking into account the shelf life of this content. And the first thing we'll look at is this concept of synchronizing content from your underlying systems. So it's critical that we're able to recognize, in a lot of large organizations, the development of content is happening in multiple places across the business. And so a catalog like this needs to be able to recognize when new content gets created, so that it can, as Marius spoke about, automatically be synchronized into the world of the BI portal, so that we can make sure it gets published in an effective way. So what does that really mean? Well, in the Metric Insights world, we have this concept of data sources which plug into the underlying tools. And here I'm looking at a connection into a Tableau server that has a bunch of content that we might be interested in. The plugin in Metric Insights is obviously authenticating in the appropriate way with that server. And typically for then a particular area of that application, so in this case, in the Tableau world, for those that are familiar, we're looking at a particular site within Tableau. It could be a particular project. It could be folders of content in other tools. It's an area where quote unquote published content, production content is getting put within those underlying tools. So we make the connection, we restrict it to a particular area in the underlying tool, and then what we have set up then is a synchronization process where anytime content, in this case Tableau workbooks, get added to that area or indeed removed from it, we're going to maintain sort of that production set of information as available to the portal. So here's the list of all the dashboards that exist on that site that we want to work with. Not only are we synchronizing what workbooks are available, We're also pulling in any metadata that exists within that underlying tool. So obviously things like what are they called, but potentially tags and descriptions if you're managing that in the underlying tool. So that again, all that information is going to be available to the end user when we look at that. So content synchronization ensures that it's not a manual process to recognize when new assets get added or indeed deprecated from the underlying tools that we're connected to. Now, that synchronization might simply publish all that content into the catalog and people can access it directly. But as we've been saying, we want some control around that publishing process. And so step 2 really is about being able to manage different workflows depending on the type of content that we're pulling in that allow the relevant parties within the organization to essentially have a checks and balances process that makes sure the content is ready for prime time with the relevant checks on the data, the relevant addition of any sort of descriptions or metadata that might be useful to the users. So what is a publishing workflow? Well, let's take initially a very simple example. And Marius sort of brought up that grid of different people responsible for different stages of the process. So if you think back to that grid on the top line, where essentially the analyst was taking care of a lot of the checks and balances, well, a workflow might look like this, where there's a number of steps where we recognize with the sync process that there's content that is pending review. We push it into a review stage, and ultimately, once it's being reviewed and checked, it gets published and certified. So in this case, there's only really one step in the publishing of this content. It comes in, we review it, it goes into a certified state. The review step is all about then saying, okay, what needs to happen as part of that review step? Well, in this case, the analyst is going to go and check the content, but also may be responsible for maybe checking and updating the name and the description, tagging it with certain fields so that users can find it, govern terms or glossary terms around the metrics and data that's in there, documenting it, maybe assigning ownership, setting classification of the data within there, any fields that are ultimately going to help the end user A, find it, and B, have the context around what it is. So this step in the workflows we'll see when we run through it allows us to generate this context before ultimately it gets pushed into this publish state, where in this case, because it's a single person certification, we're going to set that certification automatically to a bronze level. So again, end users know what that means and what the checks have been on that piece of content. So a fairly simple workflow. What does that look like to sort of the people responsible for carrying out those checks? So if I'm an analyst, I may come into sort of my queue of content that I'm responsible for. So here you can see those 3 stages that we talked about. You'll see that there's some stuff being picked up by the sync process that's ultimately pending review. There's 4 reports which are actually in my queue that I need to go and take care of. And what this allows me to do is obviously look at the content and review it, but also add in that context that we spoke about. So, maybe it is updating the description to something more useful to our users. Maybe it's tagging it with certain glossary terms that are going to be relevant. Maybe it's classifying it that it's for internal use only. I can set that metadata and then ultimately save that and move it into what is effectively a published and certified state. So in doing that, it gives it the stamp of approval. We can see who's accountable for it. And now any user effectively accessing this piece of content from the catalog that we looked at is going to see the fact that it has been certified, who certified it, any tags or descriptions that we added to it that we can see here, and get the full context behind that piece of content. So a simple workflow. Obviously, the other end of the extreme here is where maybe we've got multiple parties involved. So the bottom row of that grid within the slide that Marius was talking about, where it's not just the developer or the analyst reviewing it. Also, the business owner might come in. So, the developer might be responsible for checking it, giving it a correct name and description and assigning ownership to it. The business user might be responsible for coming in and tagging it and adding the necessary documentation around it. The data steward may simply be responsible for coming in and viewing the content, making sure that the data behind it is incorrect. Again, before it gets published into a production area for our end users. And so in this case, the workflow has multiple stages. I'm responsible for certain parts of or certain stages within this workflow. And at the end of this one, well, content may get certified with a gold stamp of approval. Again, as a user searching for this and looking at it, I know that it's been through a rigorous process and a rigorous set of checks and balances. Marius, maybe talk a little bit about different environment propagation as part of these processes. So oftentimes, in our enterprise customers, they're running different dev and live environments.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And here, what Mike is showing, there's really, it's kind of all within the same environment. But what might happen, you can imagine, if you were doing this in a QA environment where you're going through this process, moving this content in, it might be that once it gets into a published and certified state, that then triggers behind the scenes an automation script. So just like you remember the equivalent of the Devops continuous integration and build script, there's automation scripts that are running behind the scenes that can propagate this piece of content directly into the production environment. So then this can be done by a set of stakeholders in QA, and then once that process is complete, then all this metadata and all that information, everything gets moved into production automatically behind the scenes.
Great, thanks, Marius. So again, why do we do this, and what's the end result to the user? Well, as a user accessing the portal and the catalog of content I have access to now, as I'm browsing or utilizing sort of search capabilities, so maybe I'm coming in and searching through the content I have access to, because we've pushed the content through that process, we've tagged it, we've added appropriate descriptions and documentation, I can search through the catalog and more easily find things that are relevant to me, and also understand the level of certification that has been applied to that. So being able to just look at the certified content or look at it by the certain levels of certification that we've applied to it. So again, making sure that as a user coming and accessing this particular, in this case, Tableau dashboard, I have the necessary context behind it. So synchronization, publishing it in a more structured and useful way that gives us some control around it. We get the content into the portal, we get it into the catalog, it runs through its life cycle of usage. How do we then know, again, when something is starting to meet its shelf life or that we have to update it? And Marius talked about, I think you mentioned it as sort of implicit and explicit measurement and monitoring. Well, from a implicit perspective, I think, no, implicit. So
implicit. Yeah. Explicit is what they tell you.
Yeah, so implicit perspective is where we essentially want to track engagement with the content. And it's important to think about this from a holistic perspective. So if you think about the typical dashboard in an organization, I could be accessing and using that in a variety of ways. I could be coming into a catalog or a portal like Metric Insights and accessing it from there because I searched for it or it's in my favorites. I could be subscribing to it and receiving it in email. And that's ultimately how I consume it, through my email. I could be going directly into the underlying tool. I could be looking at it on my mobile device. Regardless of how people are interacting with it, we want to be tracking that as an overall engagement figure, which is the number that we're going to look at here. And so we need to be looking at engagement from both the user perspective and the user groups and the communities that we have out there. How are they engaging with the content that they have access to? And so this is down at the individual user level over time. But also, for the sake of this conversation, more around the content that we're pushing out to them. And being able to look over different periods of time, what content is getting used, what's popular, what's increasing because it's growing in popularity, what's decreasing over time, potentially getting to the point where it's meeting its shelf life, what's going unused, and that could either be because it's met its shelf life, or perhaps again people just aren't aware of it and it should be stuff that we're promoting better. But get this visibility into what the usage and relevancy is of the content that's out there in the catalog. And it's important to look at that at quite a detailed level, because just because something had 693 views over the last 60 days, is that because it's useful, or is that because we created it 60 days ago, we told everyone about it, 693 people came in on day one and then have never accessed it again. And so being able to get visualizations such as this one, where over time you can look at how individuals or user groups engage with data. Are they coming in and sticking to the middle because they look at it every day, or do we have a problem like this where again we publish this, they came in, they spent a while looking at it, but then over time they're kind of drifting to the outside because they're not finding this content useful anymore. This might be an indication that again something is meeting its shelf life at this point. We should also look at usage again from sort of a user behavior perspective. So we talked about sort of search and what people are looking at. Usage, a lack of usage could be it's not useful. A lack of usage could be because they can't find it in the first place. And so tracking things as well, like what are people searching for? Are they finding useful content? Are they not finding useful content? Should we be tagging things better as part of that publishing process? If we know what people are trying to find, then that gives us a better opportunity of managing that. So implicit ways of monitoring the content through tracking engagement with it itself. The explicit way is to gather feedback on the reports that you're putting out there. And so, within a portal like Metric Insights, it's critical that you can basically receive feedback from the users in a structured way. And we do that through this concept of being able to define feedback prompts, which effectively ask questions of the users and allows them to rate the usefulness, I guess, of that report. And so, the typical sort of prompt here, would you recommend this to other users on a scale of 1 to 10? Unlikely to likely. You can control how often the prompts show up across the content that you're assigning to this. You can choose to receive specific feedback on this as well. And ultimately, to the users, as they're accessing content, I had a chart open here. As they're accessing content, now and again, without spamming them, obviously, you can start to receive feedback on the content, and similar to what you might see on a website or an e-commerce site, allow them to start rating the content in a way that's providing that explicit feedback. So as you capture comments on this, you can start to then combine that with the usage figures that we're looking at. So as a maybe publisher of this particular dashboard, if I look at the engagement with it, I can kind of marry those two things up. So here's an example, as we saw in that animation, where actually usage of this pretty much dropped off rapidly back in October, and we're getting pretty much no use of it from an engagement point of view. And if I look at that feedback, it's predominantly trending into the red. It turns out we probably did a restructure and created a new version of this dashboard. But if this one gets left behind, imagine the confusion that that's going to cause if someone new comes into the organization and stumbles across it without, and there's 3 versions of it out there or something like that. So here's an example where it's pretty obvious I want to disable or deprecate this content. I probably want to decertify it, move it into a disabled state, maybe even go and delete it in the underlying BI tool at this point. So we can marry those 2 sorts of implicit and explicit feedback together, and again use it as a way of keeping I think you called it a manicured garden of content that is relevant to our users. So publish things, monitoring it over time, getting feedback, and then understanding when things should be reviewed and looked at from an update perspective, as we had in that diagram. So typically, as a publisher of content and as part of these workflows, over time, I'm going to be responsible for coming in and attesting to the relevancy of each dashboard and report as it stands at that point in time. So that could be time-based, it could be on a regular basis, but I can be alerted to any dashboards that are essentially up for review, up for attestation, that I need to go and look at and determine whether they still should be certified, whether they still should be in the system. So having a way of alerting the owners to that process, like we're seeing here, I might receive an email that directs me that these 3 reports are up for a review, that I can go into that review process and see that in this case they're still certified, they're still out there in the catalog, they're still being used potentially. And in this case, again, I'm probably responsible for looking at these, checking they're still relevant, looking at the engagement, checking the tags and the descriptions, make sure anything hasn't changed in here that might require an update. And if it has, maybe moving it back into the review process. So assigning it back to the original people who are responsible for it, or if it is all good to go, again, completing that review and leaving it in the portal as is. It's important to do that a level of attestation to make sure that the content out there it isn't obsolete and isn't cluttering the environment, as Marius spoke about. So we've been through quite a lot of stuff. Just to sort of review and finalize, I'm just going to go back to the slides quickly. It's worth looking at that final slide again, Marius, just to summarize. And then, feel free to enter any questions you might have into the chat window, and we'll get to those. Bear with me. So yeah, again, in summary, what we looked at was this ability to synchronize content from your underlying systems. That shouldn't be a manual process. Pulling the metadata that you're setting up already, having a structured way of having the correct workflow for the content that is in place to publish that in an effective way for your users. And then from an operational perspective, monitoring that over time in both an implicit way, tracking usage, how much usage you're getting on that content, and gathering feedback about it so that you can get some indication of why usage might be trending in one way or another. And then, the whole point of all of this is understanding that something has a shelf life. Everything has a shelf life. Making sure you have those review processes in place and can attest to its relevancy still, though it should be in the portal and the catalog. So let's transition over to any questions that we may have. I'm just going to stop sharing here a minute so I can see the window. So we do have a couple for maybe the last 5 minutes here. Marius, maybe you can jump in. So the first is, so who is responsible for BI ops? I think that's an interesting discussion, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and you think, unlike these days, if you think about DevOps, there's a lot of times you're hiring kind of a DevOps engineer, and they're completely dedicated to that process. BI ops is a little bit different in that typically what you're looking is to really assign responsibility to people that are already on the team, just make sure people have the right responsibility, taking on the right responsibility. So it's saying, let's devise the correct BI ops process for the organization, make sure that you've got the technology to support that process, and then it's about enabling the existing BI developers to follow their part of the process, the business partners that are working with those developers to build content. They can do their part by certifying loss returns, etc. And then the data governance team and the pipeline engineers can do their piece. Data governance team perhaps establishing some of the criteria for certification. Here are the checklists that need to be done, identifying from a governance perspective what are the metadata fields that need to be set as a standard across the organization, and then working with with the COE for the portal solution to ensure that the workflows are implemented in place to support the particular practices that have been agreed upon within the organization. So it's always those three things working together, right? People, process, and technology. In this case, the people should be really the same people you have in place now, just following a slightly different process and leveraging a technology that supports that process so that the effective BI ops and governance can take place.
There's a question here about the review and attestation process. How do you determine when that needs to happen? What triggers that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it varies to some extent. It depends answers, but typically there may be kind of two things that would trigger that, often based on the certification level. There might be some attestation requirements you agree to as from a governance perspective. So those things obviously that are certified highest should be attested more frequently, because if you're saying that something is gold certified and in fact that's an obsolete piece of content, that's going to lose a lot of credibility with your business. So the level of certification is one driver. The other driver is based on events that occur within the business. So if you know that you have an example we have with the sales ops example I gave, if you know that your territories get realigned every year, then the dashboards that cover sales ops, they should probably be reattested to associate with that timeline. So you might have a calendar of events that then drives the automated attestation there. And the key is that you can have multiple things that trigger attestation, whether it's a specific calendar preset or a certain amount of elapsed time. But in either way, it should translate into a workflow type of action, like Mike showed, where you can't count on your analysts remembering to go and check and do the attestation, nor should it be something that you put on them to say once a quarter you've got to go attest everything. It should really be more of a trickle where you get on a weekly or a monthly basis the one or two or three items that you need to attest to because you're responsible to them. You go in with a few clicks, you either attest to those items or you remove them, and then you move on. So by making it kind of a painless process that doesn't require you to spend hours and hours and hours doing it, you can make sure that it's effective, and you can have it happening at a frequency that's relevant to the content to make sure that it stays active.
A question here about the certification levels. How do you determine a certification level for a piece of content, and why isn't everything just gold?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question, and I think it's some topics that we've covered a bit in a different webinar, but we can speak to it a little bit here. Is that when you look at a piece of content, I think you want to look at really there's sort of two dimensions we like to think of looking at it. Your organization might have more than that, but really thinking about what is the impact of that content, how broadly is it consumed within the organization, and then how what is the magnitude of the impact of an issue happening with that data being misinterpreted or so forth. So for example, example I often give, if you've got something that's going to the board, financial reporting to the board, that has tremendous impact as far as if there's any kind of issue with that data, it's going to have a very negative impact on an organization as a whole. If you have something that's going out to 1,000 salespeople, that different kind of impact from a breadth perspective that has a huge amount of impact. It's affecting a lot of people. If there's an issue with that, there's going to be potentially ramifications to the organization. So those things are really worth putting through a heavier process where more eyes are on that, where you've got those multiple stakeholders involved in the certification process, and the certification level should reflect the fact that it's gone through a more rigorous process. But not every visualization that you create is going to be suitable for that. Oftentimes, you might have a visualization or an AI model or something that you've published to the portal that's being used by a small group of users. Sure, it has impact, it's meaningful to those users, but it doesn't have that broad impact on the organization, and you're not going to put alerting on that. You're not going to go through a vetting process where you're associating with enterprise KPIs just because it's not that important of a piece of content. So I would say the answer to that question is you make an assessment on the impact of the content, the impact of any kind of data issues of that content, and then based on that, you designate the appropriate level of certification for the content, and then it gets onboarded through the right workflow for that level of certification.
Well, good. I think that's the questions we had. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Always happy to continue the conversation on email. Both Mike and Maris and my address here that you can reach out to. But look forward to joining you on the next webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.